All right, welcome to our Department of Education, Office of Indian Education Technical Assistance webinar for the NAL ED grant. This is our Promising Practices and Lessons Learned webinar. So thank you for joining us. We are going to start by playing our standard disclaimer. This presentation was produced under U.S. Department of Education contract number ED-ESE 15A0015/0006 with Synergy Enterprises, Inc. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education of any product, commodity, service, or enterprise mentioned herein is intended or should be inferred. All right, so as we get going today, we are going to do just a few introductions, and then we will jump right into our content. We're going to be going through 5 different areas in regards to the NAL ED grant, referencing some material from existing grantees and sharing some best practices and lessons learned from the last 3 years of the practitioner's work. And then we will wrap up with some time for questions and some final tips. As we go along, if you have any questions, please place those in the chat box, and we will get to those at the end of each section and then again at the end of our time together today. And I'm going to turn it over to Angela Hernandez-Marshall to introduce our Office of Indian Education staff.
Thank you, Sarah. Again, this is Angela. I'm with the Office of Indian Education, and I support the Native American Language Program, as well as the Indian Professional Development Program, which is not running a competition this year. I'm not sure if my supervisor and one of our newest members, Donna Savis-Burns, is on yet, Sarah, but hopefully she'll have a chance to join us today, so I'll just introduce her for now. We are really excited to have an opportunity to share with folks what we have learned, what some of the promising practices are for that cohort that was awarded the initial cohort for this grant program. And I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah to talk about that a little bit more. And I'll just say I'll be online and I'll be monitoring the chat box. The expectation should be that anything related to the application package itself, and I know she'll talk about this again, should continue to be directed to nal@ed.gov. And today we'll talk about the work. Thank you.
Thanks, Angela. And now we want to introduce our technical assistance team. I'm Sarah Brightwell. I'm the lead technical assistance specialist for the NAL ED project. And with us today also is Kathleen.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kathleen Bethke. I'm the current project director for the NAL ED Technical Assistance Contract. And I believe we have Miranda Cairns online. Miranda, you're muted if you're trying to talk. Maybe not. Okay, Sarah Whitehead.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Whitehead and I'm the project coordinator for the current grant program.
Okay, and then Sherry Lover, who's our corporate monitor, and Charlotte Soriano, who's another coordinator with our team, are unable to be here today. So thank you for coming.
Well, and now that you know a bit about us, we'd like to get to know you a bit better. So we have a poll that should pop up on your screen for you. If you could indicate what type of entity you're representing today. So, select whichever one best describes you. If one of these just doesn't seem like the best fit for you, feel free to put your alternate response over in the chat box. So we'll give you just a few moments to make your selection in the poll. If you are joining from a mobile device, you may have to scroll screens to see the poll, or you're welcome to just pop that answer in the chat box. We appreciate you participating in the polls. It's helpful for information gathering as we go through the day. All right, looks like just about everybody has had an opportunity to vote. So we appreciate you doing that. And we will go to our next question, which is, where are you from? So where is your organization? And you can put that answer over in the chat box. If you'll just place your state over in the chat box, we'll actually be tabulating them straight from there. If you are looking for the chat box, maybe this is your first time on Zoom, you will be able to find that. Typically, if you look at the either top of your screen, there'll be some 3 little dots over on the side that will take you to the chat box, or sometimes it's at the bottom of your screen with a little talk bubble. So if you will go over to the chat box and just pop in the state where you are located. And while you're finishing up your voting on that, I do want to just share kind of an overview here before we begin. This webinar is really intended to share promising practices that were learned through this first 3 years of the NAL ED grant program. So it's not intended to cover all of the information that would be necessary for you to successfully apply for the current NAL ED grant competition. So for that full information, we really suggest that you read the notice inviting applications and the application package. We're going to place that over in the chat box. So if you haven't seen that yet, you can download it directly from the chat box, as well as we'll put the link to the Office of Indian Education NAL ED grant page. We'll put that direct link over in the chat box. At that link, you can also download that information. You can also review the recording of the pre-application workshops that took place over the last 2 weeks. And that's also where you can see the list of those who have submitted their notice of intent to apply thus far. And so that brings us to our next poll question, and the last one for a little bit, which is, have you submitted a notice of intent to apply yet? So that'll pop up on the screen. This is an easy, fast finger question. Yes or no if you have submitted a notice of intent to apply. If you have not, please remember that a notice of intent to apply does not commit you to anything. You can submit one and then choose not to actually submit a grant proposal, and vice versa. Even if you don't submit one, you can, but the department would encourage you to submit one. If you look on the link, it will show that notice of intents to apply were due at the end of July, but they are still accepting them, and that list on the webpage is still being updated. So it looks like most everyone has locked their answers in there. If you need more information on the notice of intent to apply, visit that web link, and it will also tell you exactly where to send it to nal@ed.gov and what information to include. As we go throughout today, you're going to be hearing from program leaders from 2 of our current NAL ED grantees. We were able to actually record interviews with their program leaders and take footage in their language classrooms in February and March of this year. And we hope that you really find some value in the lessons that they've learned over the last 3 years of project implementation. But I want to tell you a little bit about each of the programs just to give you kind of some background before you hear from them throughout the day. The first program is Waduka Dotting in Hayward, Wisconsin. This was an existing language program. Through the grant, their project was working to expand and improve services for their students. So their language of instruction is Ojibwe. Their instruction method was full immersion. Their entire school is full immersion. While they do offer all the way from kindergarten through 8th grade, this project was solely focused on that middle school age group from 4th to 8th grade. At the start of the project, their school ended at 7th grade, so one of their primary grant activities was to add that 8th grade level. They wanted to train and certify 5 new teachers, develop a comprehensive middle school curriculum for those 4th through 8th graders, and then also refine their existing Ojibwe language assessment. Then we have the second program that you'll hear from, which was the Anchorage School District. Their language of instruction was Yupik, and they were operating at a dual language level. So the students spent half the day in a full immersion Yupik classroom, and they spent half the day in a fully English language classroom. They were learning science, social studies, and Yupik language arts in Yupik. And then they were learning English language arts and math in English. Their program now serves kindergarten through 2nd grade. Since it was a brand new program, in year 1, they added kinder, and then first, and then this school year, they'll be adding that second grade level. The other components of their project were to develop out those science, social studies, and UPIC language arts curriculum and their language assessment. And they chose to do that not just for K2, but they actually did that for K6. And you'll hear later in the day why they thought that was so important for their project. So just to give you a little information about them before we start hearing some of their lessons learned and tips for you. So we're going to start out with just some general advice from the current grantees. When we were filming with them, we asked them all to share with us some things that they thought would be important to know, some lessons that they had learned that would be good for new grant applicants to think about.
I think another thing, you got to take into account when you're a new program is make sure you have realistic expectations for your program. Make sure you're realistic with your deadlines, realistic. I think some people will jump into immersion and want to go K through 8th grade starting this fall. And I really encourage people to start slow, make sure you're well staffed, make sure you're well funded, because you're going to work harder than other teachers. The other mainstream teachers that are teaching in a colonial language have an advantage of centuries of literature and curriculum at their disposal. Whereas folks working in endangered indigenous language, you're going to have to make your stuff. So I think adding grades gradually, and having a team of people working towards expanding your programs rather than it all falling on teachers. I think that's some pretty good advice for people moving forward, is carefully plan and be realistic with what you're doing.
So for future grantees, people that are interested in applying for a grant like this, I think that it's really important to do your research ahead of time, to really take a look at what programs are out there already. Every language group, indigenous or not, would probably like to have their own unique program. But I think by joining forces, by coming together, by building community partnerships, by looking at the needs of students and also the desires of the community as well. You can create a program in any language, but if there isn't the supply and demand, then you're going to have a really hard time sustaining the program. There are already a lot of existing really well done immersion programs in this country, indigenous and not. And I think it's really important to take a look at program models, to take a look at the availability of resources, and including human resources, to take a look at state certification requirements for teachers. Many indigenous speakers are native speakers of their language, but not necessarily educators or licensed educators, and that can sometimes cause some problems with the development of a program.
I think one of the biggest challenges that I would express to people from outside, because it's like we have internal challenges between us and about us, and this is about our language and our lifeways and our land. There's that type of challenge, but if I think about the context of within an educational system that our students are required to attend and be a part of, I would say the biggest challenge that I have encountered is that people don't think that an Ojibwe language medium-based education is an education. So I think being tied to this notion that English only is the only way you can expand your intellectual capacities is one that we really need to reconsider in the United States, because it's a hindrance to our people. I mean, our people as our citizenry. People in many other countries are multilingual, multiliterate, and I think by thinking that way, we're keeping our people from really having the level of intellectual capacity that they could have. So, and it's easier to begin that as like a habit within younger students and to make it normal. So normalizing multilingualism, multiculturalism, it has to be part of the approach to teaching and learning.
So you'll notice as we go throughout today, we'll continue to reference some of these lessons learned and talk a little bit more in depth about them. But you'll see that one of the biggest lessons learned from the grantees, both as you see it in the video and as we talk throughout the webinar, is that their projects really needed to be ambitious, but also reasonable. They wanted to always be doing the most and the best through their project, but it was also important that they were reasonable and realistic about what was feasible within the scope of a 3-year project. So we're going to go into our first section today, which is talking about project design. You'll notice that each of the sections that we're going to talk about today align with the 5 sections of the evaluation criteria for the grant proposals. So if you're taking notes or anything with that, they may help you kind of correlate the information. So the first thing we wanted to talk about as far as lessons learned had to do with projects, goals, objectives, outcomes. So as we think about this selection criteria, you're asked to create project goals, objectives, and outcomes. And the grantees were asked to have those be specific and measurable. But they found sometimes that as they were then trying to implement, that their goals and objectives were not as specific and measurable as they might have thought they were. And that provided some challenges in implementation. And so some time was spent then at the beginning of their projects, really revising those goals and objectives to be more specific and measurable. So in general, it was a requirement that they report on the 4 GEPRA measures annually. And we'll talk about those 4 GEPRA measures because those are the same in the new grant competition as well. And so they were encouraged to set their goals and objectives in relation to both those 4 GEPRA, as well as in relation to the primary project activities and deliverables from their application. So they really had to think through what they wanted to accomplish by the end of the 3-year grant period and what their grant application said they were going to accomplish by the end of the 3-year grant period, and then really align their goals and objectives with that to highlight those key aspects of their project. And to make sure that they had an associated outcome for each one of those, so making that measurable. And then above all, they really had to think through, and this is what a lot of them kind of realized when they were looking back at their grant applications, was that some of their goals and objectives were very ambitious, but not necessarily reasonable. And so that was one of the biggest pieces there, was really making sure that those goals and objectives were specific, measurable, and achievable. It was something reasonable for the project scope. So we talked about the GEPRA. There are 4 GEPRA for the NAL ED grant. The first one being the number and percentage of participating students who attain proficiency in a native language as determined by each grantee through pre- and post-session assessments of native language proficiency. The big thing there to note being measure 1 is looking at proficiency, language proficiency. For measure 2, the number and percentage of participating students who make progress in learning a native language as determined by each grantee through pre- and post-session assessments of native language proficiency. The key with 2 being, we're looking at language progress, okay? So they're asking you in 1 to measure and report on proficiency, and on 2 to measure and report on progress. You'll notice it is entirely up to the program teams how they're going to do that. The GEPRA measures do not specify what type of measurement has to be used there, what type of assessment. So each of the grantees were able to determine what type of native language assessment really was the best fit for their project and their community. Now, for measure 3, the number and percentage of participating students who show an improvement in academic outcomes as measured by academic assessments or other indicators. So with this being asked to measure and report on academic improvement, Again, it doesn't stipulate how that has to be measured or what constitutes improvement. That determination was up to the program team to determine what was going to count as improvement and how they were going to measure that. And then the final GEPRA measure being the difference between the average daily attendance of participating students and the average daily attendance of all students in a comparison group. So with measure 4, having to make that average daily attendance comparison, the grantees had to determine what would be an appropriate comparison group. So some utilized non-participating students from other campuses or the non-participating students from their own campus. Some looked at similar student groups from possibly another school or school district, but it was really just looking at what was going to be a viable comparison group. And they had to think about data availability. So, even if they were to find a good comparison group, were they going to be able to access the average daily attendance to then make that comparison and do their reporting? So as we think a bit more about this piece, and particularly measure 1 and measure 2, then we're going to think specifically about the native language assessment. So they really had to think about both the proficiency and the progress and the pre and post assessment, because there were no specifics around how that had to be done. So they had to think about how they wanted to measure that. And it was important to really consider some of the groups had existing native language standards, or they had existing native language assessments. But even with that, were they appropriate for their students? So for instance, we had one group that was going to use an existing language assessment, but then when they began implementation, they realized that that existing language assessment was not developmentally appropriate for their age level of students. And so it wasn't going to be useful in giving them actual data for instruction or for reporting. So really looking at those pieces and parts. Also, some ran into the issue of certain organizations, whether it be their tribe or tribal entities that had created assessments that required use of a specific assessment. So they really had to check with everyone involved in order to determine if there were any existing requirements about what type of assessment was to be used. They also had to think through some other pieces and parts with that. Things like who were going to conduct the assessment. So one grantee, with their particular language, females had to deliver the assessment to females, males had to deliver the assessment to males. But that meant they also had to have that availability of staff or even external contracted staff to come in and deliver that assessment. They had to think through whether it was an assessment that could be done in groups, whether small or whole group, whether it was something that had to be done individually, because all of that had implications on not just their staffing, but also their budget. And then finally, they had to think through what their measurement was going to assess and what they wanted it to assess. So for the vast majority of the grantees, their languages are primarily oral languages. And so most of them went with some form of oral language assessment. Some have also included listening because they wanted to assess students' ability to comprehend when they were being spoken to. So they'll do things like following directions and things within the assessment. And then some with their older students are moving toward including reading and writing because at that level it was more developmentally appropriate and they had the language skills with which to do so. So those were all things that really had to be thought about early on in the planning process and in that initial phase of implementation in order to make their projects successful. So let's hear a little bit more about language assessment straight from the programs.
So developing a language proficiency assessment is a critical piece of any language program. And for several years, our district, the Anchorage School District, has been working with Avant Assessment out of Eugene, Oregon. And they have an assessment called STAMP which is a proficiency-based, web-based, and adaptive language assessment that measures proficiency skills in reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And they have developed that STAMP assessment in multiple languages. We have purchased that assessment in all of our existing language programs and wanted to make sure that we had something very consistent for UBIC as well. And so actually our team, our instructional team is working with Avant to develop a UBIC STAMP test as well. So that we'll be able to measure students across the district with kind of the same tool. And we use that data to really guide our instruction so that we can find out where the students are with their language proficiency levels and where, maybe where we're challenged and where we need to increase in terms of instruction. So the STAMP assessment is really designed for students probably around grade 2 and above. In fact, they have 2 versions of STAMP. The 4SE is for grades 2 through probably 6, and then the 4S, 4 skills, is for grade 7 and above. But because we're not even at 2nd grade yet, and we definitely needed to have some sort of language proficiency tool, or assessment tool, we use the ELLOPA, the ELLOPA, and that is really designed for those primary grades based on teacher observation and either one-on-one contact with the students or the teacher observing the students speaking to each other.
Yeah, so in our modified SOPA assessment that we do with 4th through 8th graders, it's more like an interview with 2 students at a time. So we'll pair up 2 students. Typically, we'll be intentional on the pairing. So we like to pair a more proficient student with a less proficient student, so the more proficient student can serve as a language model for the less proficient student. And we bring them in, we record them, and we have a conversation. Within the conversation, I build in various tasks. So there'll be a intentional task that they're to complete. So sometimes I'll have a picture sorting task, and then they'll have to narrate about the pictures.
This is a triangle of like stages of Ojibwe that we like speak. So the first stage is usually when we're like little kids and we only know like a few words like buju and like elk and stuff. And then the second one is like where we start to understand like sentences and the way like how you put words together. And this one, is like paragraphs and more like complex words. And the top one is most of the elders because they know a lot of words and like stories and they have a lot of knowledge about that. So, yeah.
I've built in conversational prompts between the participants, so they have to ask each other questions and answer, and then report back to me. So every round of assessment that we do, I sort of modify it and I'll change the tasks because it does become stale if the kids are doing this twice a year and we have to do the same thing again, that kind of thing. So I'll try to change it up and mix it up. But it's pretty informal, it's not a grammar test, it's not a writing exam, it's just a communicative task to see how well they can perform spontaneously with the language. And then when we rate that, we take into account their listening comprehension, so that were they following the directions carefully? Did they need repetition? Did they need me to slow down at the pace I was speaking? That kind of thing. And then we take into account the text type and their fluency. So are they speaking in words, sentences, or full-blown paragraphs? Is the language coming out pretty fluid, or do they need to pause and think quite a bit? Another thing we take into account is the grammar. So how well-formed are the utterances they're producing? Is it typical Ojibwe, or are there things lacking? And I think when we get the results, when we get the data and do the ratings, it really informs the instruction as to what's missing in our programming. Are we maximizing output to an efficient level? to where they're sort of sounding like models. And then the other area we look at is their vocabulary. So do they have a extensive vocabulary, or is it mainly generic terminology? So with our Ojibwe language and our Ojibwe lifestyle, there's a specific vocabulary for every sort of thing we do. Being that it's a verb-based language, if you've never been engaged in that particular activity, you're probably going to be at a loss for the terminology to adequately talk about it. Though a highly proficient kid can get by with generic vocabulary and circumlocution, but we like to see the vocabulary grow as well with their language ability. So that really is the core of my teaching. I really try to beef up our older students with an extensive vocabulary. I'm always getting words from elders and folks more proficient than me, and then bringing them back to the school and teaching them to the kids so they can carry them on for us.
So you'll notice in that video that the Anchorage program decided to partner with an external organization that had expertise in assessment, and they worked with their internal instructional team to create a brand new assessment. While at Waduka Dawning, they were able to leverage the skills of their staff linguists that you saw here in the video to actually refine their existing assessment to work just a little bit better for that older group of students. The other thing to think about in regards to assessment development is that some groups needed to develop a native language assessment, and that became a really integral part of their project. But they also had to think about, what percentage of their grant funds they were going to need to devote to that, because it was going to take, whether it was the money to pay for an external provider or whether it was the money to pay for staff to be working outside of the traditional school day, it was going to take a significant chunk of their budget to then develop their assessment. And they had to think about, who was the best person or group of people, what the timeline was, because they needed to be able to at some point start using this assessment, because if they're going to be measuring GEPRA 1 and 2, they needed something to be able to use. So what were they going to use in the meantime until their new official language assessment was ready? So what could they use for now, even if it was a slightly more informal or kind of changing piece of assessment, but what could they use to get that formative data to inform their instruction and to do their reporting while they were developing that assessment? So they had lots of things to really think about in that realm. And then they also had to think about the academic assessment side, because for Measure 3, they had to measure and report on academic improvement through an assessment or other indicators. And because it wasn't stipulated how that was to be done, they also had the option to assess their students in English or in the native language. But they still had to think about, did they have existing assessments in their native language that they could use? So even if they wanted to be able to deliver their assessments in Navajo, if they didn't have a math assessment already developed, then they had to go through that same thinking process of who could develop it, how they would go about that, what funds would that take, and through that whole process again. Then they also had to think about, as far as the measurement piece, were they going to measure a specific core content area? Were they going to look at academic achievement overall? So for instance, we had many grantees who chose to focus on English language arts as the area in which they were measuring academic improvement for GEPRA 3. But we also had some who set other objectives in their project regarding academic achievement of their students in general. So looking maybe at overall academic averages for all of their classes. So lots of options of things that they were thinking about there. They also had to think about the pre and the post piece. So we had a number of grantees who originally thought, I'm going to use whatever the state standardized test is, but that became problematic from a reporting standpoint and from using that for, again, that formative piece to inform instruction, because since it's only administered once a year, there's really not a clear-cut pre and post. So a majority of the grantees ended up selecting to use benchmark assessments, because then they had a beginning of year, middle of year, and end of year data piece through those assessments. They were able to make their comparisons both for reporting as well as to inform instruction throughout the year. They also found that that data was just more readily available. A number of the grantees had to think about, if they had students who were in multiple schools or working with multiple entities, how available data were to them. Because then when it comes time to do your reporting, if you're not able to get the data, that was very challenging for them. So they had to then think about, how they could access the data. And as we'll talk about later, how they could work with their partners to make that relationship smooth and the data sharing smooth.
And just FYI, Angela posted in the chat box some language directly from the NIA.
Perfect. And then the final piece, as we think about this goals and objectives piece, is to think about other project measures. Because while all of the grantees set their goals around the GEPRA, so they had to report on the GEPRA, they also set some SMART goals, which we'll talk about briefly in regards to the GEPRA, but they also had other project measures that they were setting objectives for, because there were other grant activities and deliverables that were key to their project. And so you want to be able to report on those. So they wanted to be able to highlight them. So some of the things that the existing grantees included in their project objectives, because they were integral parts of their project, were grade level expansion. Many of them were adding grade levels each year of their project. Many were building school or project capacity, so they were measuring the increase in student enrollment. All but one of the grantees were engaged in curriculum and assessment development, so they had set project objectives around accomplishing those curriculum pieces and those assessment pieces. We had about half of the grantees who included some measures of social and emotional well-being. Many of the grantees had goals around staffing, about being able to get the number of staff they needed, the quality of staff that they needed, the experience level and language level of staff they needed. All of the grantees included things around professional development and the opportunities that they were affording to their staff and their team to build a high quality program. Most of the grantees included some goals around engagement in cultural events and activities, even beyond what was provided through the school day. And then many also included things around family engagement. And so ensuring that families are engaged in the language learning process with their students, and often the families actually learning the language alongside their students. So all of them set a myriad of other project objectives that all aligned with those key project activities and deliverables that were described in their grant application. And so we're going to share another clip here where they're going to talk just a bit more about some of the other project pieces and components that were really important to their projects.
The elders always told us that language and culture can't be separated. So that is something that we've really strived to keep that at the forefront of our thinking, and when we develop curriculum too, like go to the sugar bush, and there's math, there's social studies, there's language arts, there's everything, all the content areas are integrated in all of our activities.
As far as the success that we've seen here at Wadukadading, I think the main contributor to that is people who believe in our language and people who believe in our way of life as a people. I think it's really hard these days, you know, a lot of our more mainstream counterparts believe that our success needs to be measured in comparison to the Western world, and that success in education is measured by test scores and is measured by other sort of gatekeeping models that have you know, always been at a disservice to our people. So I think the success here lies in a totally different approach. It's not our mission to educate these kids in the same system that has consistently failed us since its inception. I think the key to our success here at Wadukadare is taking what our people have valued here for centuries, that made our people a dominant force in this part of North America for centuries. And what was it about that? What was the value system like? What was the diet like? The lifestyle, the spiritual mindset, and somehow finding a way to incorporate that in our academics. So when the kids get through learning different content areas, different subjects in school, it's all framed in a Anishinaabe context. It's all framed in a way that's familiar to them, that's highly valued by them and their families. And I think that's what leads to our success, rather than just translating English textbooks and going for this one-to-one match with our colonizers. We sort of scrap that model, and what is it that sustains us? And we see like academic success with that. I think when you build up a child's pride and identity and who they are, they're much more likely to succeed in school. And I think that's what that's the key. That's the key ingredient to any of these kind of programs.
And so the grantees really realized that by aligning their project objectives with these really key components of their project, they were really painting a picture of what success looked like for their program and for their students and for their staff. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen to share a bit more.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So Sarah mentioned it early on in the presentation around the goals and objectives needing to be specific and measurable. But what we found with the grantees, and I think they would agree at this point, is making every goal and objective SMART. And I'm going to go through this just a little bit with you guys. I'm hoping you've heard of SMART goals before, but if not, you're going to hear a little bit about them today. So your goal and objectives need to be specific. In this instance, it's all about language immersion. So whatever way you're approaching your project, your goals need to be very specifically connected to how you're going to accomplish what the objectives are for this project. Measurable. A lot of people get confused about measurable and they want to put a number in front of it. Measurable means that you have an assessment tool or some other way of measuring whether or not the goal was met. And in the GEPR statements, they very clearly say pre and post assessment. But as Sarah was saying, some of the grantees decided to use benchmarks and those types of things. So you just need to have some way of measuring that, whether it's a survey or it's an observation or it's a rubric or whatever it happens to be. Achievable is where you get that number from. What I've seen, and I'm sure Sarah would agree, is across grantees, whether it's this one or another one, the achievable part gets kind of crazy. So she said, you want to be ambitious, but be reasonable. And a lot of times when folks are designing their proposals, they shoot over because they believe that if they say 100% of students are going to be proficient in the first year, that's automatically going to mean, an award. But the problem comes after award when you're trying to actually achieve that goal and it's not reasonable anymore. So be thoughtful about what you can actually do in each year of your grant. And then relevant, make it relevant to whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. So if you're setting a program goal around culture and you wanted to connect to the language proficiency somehow, then you want to make sure that that goal is written in a way that it ties very clearly to why you're offering that additional approach into your program design. And then of course, time bound, because if you don't set a time to measure it, you won't likely measure whether you've done it or not. What our grantees have seen is that if they set SMART goals, they more than likely can show outcomes. A lot of times they're positive outcomes, but even if they're not reached, they at least have some baseline by which to determine whether or not they could change something in order to make that goal happen better. So it's an easier way to kind of pinpoint where something's not quite right. All right, so let's look at a sample goal. So this might be a goal that we saw in the first year. The program will increase the number of fluent native language speakers by the end of the grant program. Is it specific? The program will increase the number of fluent native speakers. You could say that that is specific. That is the overarching goal of the grant program. Is it measurable? Anybody want to take a guess? Is it measurable? You can say yes or no in the chat box. Is it achievable? Do we even know what they're trying to achieve? Is it relevant? Well, it's relevant. And is it time bound? Well, we have by the end of the grant period. Is that 3 years or is that 1 year? So this is not a SMART goal. And we're going to show you what it would look like if it became a SMART goal. So by the end of the grant period, right, that's time bound, the program will increase the number of age appropriate, I think that should be appropriate, native language proficient students to 50 as measured by the native language pre and post assessment. So you can very clearly see we've got the specific, so they're increasing the number of age appropriate native language proficient students. That's very specific. It is measurable. They're going to use pre and post assessments to do that. It's achievable. That would be, you know, up to you, but 50 sounds like a reasonable number. So that's achievable. And you might even add in here 50 out of whatever number of students you have to make it even more specific. It's relevant because it's targeting very directly the proficiency that GEPRA won, and it's time bound. We see at the very front of that. So all of your goals and objectives should be SMART. And I would say even as grantees started, we worked with them right at the beginning on SMART goals and objectives, but if they had done that early on as part of their design, the design would have fallen in much easier because they would have their goals and then they would know what they need in order to reach those goals. So SMART objectives are really a best practice for any program and specifically for this one. All right, family engagement. You saw earlier where a lot of grantees chose to include family engagement. It's really important to include family because we don't know, first off, do the families currently speak the native language at home? Do they need to learn the language? How can they help their own students in learning the language at home? If they're not native speakers, then how are you going to design your program so that they can engage with their families at home? Might there be another key component to this where you're helping the families actually learn the language alongside students? A lot of the grantees were looking at that. And then how do you engage them in cultural events and activities? Some of the grantees even identified native speakers available in their own community. We'll talk about that a little more in the staffing portion of this presentation, but family engagement is a very important part of any student learning. And so you're going to want to make sure that you address how you intend to engage families going forward in this work. All right, and here we're going to see just a little clip from our grantees on lessons learned around family engagement.
So one of the key components of the grant that we wrote was to build in a program coordinator specific to this program. In my role with the school district, I oversee all language programs at all levels, kindergarten through 12th grade. And as devoted as I am to this particular program, especially in terms of the grant writing and managing the grant, the success of the program is definitely not due to me. We have a program coordinator, Katie Tanuchik, who has really been the driving force of the program in terms of working with staff, working with parents, working with the principal. She's really the community face of the program, if you will. And being Alaska Native and Yupik herself, she brings that perspective to the program and can easily work with Alaska Native families and encourage them to consider putting their child in this program. She also takes really good care of the teachers and does a lot of outside community work in terms of organizing cultural field trips. This grant has received quite a bit of publicity from not just local media, but media from outside. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, we had a group of visitors from Japan. Japan's only indigenous group came over to visit this program. And so the program has gotten a lot of attention, and there needed to be a point person for that to really to allow the program to shine. So having a program coordinator is a very, very integral part of the grant and of any program, really. We're very fortunate to have her in this role, and I sure wish that we had a program coordinator in all of our other immersion programs.
Nice. Okay, any questions around family engagement before we move on? Or any other part? Okay, feel free to post questions in the chat box as we move through the presentations. If we don't answer it right away, we'll get to it at the end. Okay. So now we're going to talk about partnerships. And we'll watch a quick clip, and then we'll talk about partnerships after this clip.
I guess my advice for people considering starting something like this, I would encourage them to just gather people that share the vision. And of course, we all know human nature, there will be debates and arguments, but with the strong mission, everyone will come back to it and support or take a break and come back. I've seen a lot of things happen over the last 20 years with our crew of people. But I would say just start.
I think collaboration is key. I wouldn't have been able to do this, or we wouldn't be able to have as robust of a program if it wasn't for those partnerships. We brought a lot of people in. Brendan Locke, who is our director for world languages, was instrumental. He had a lot of research and a lot of friends in that particular arena that he brought forth in research, and that was key. It's a Western perspective that was definitely brought in. And then bringing in Rochelle Adams and Heritage Center and our partnership with Head Start that have been doing this and working with families and thinking about the needs, and the charter school. So bringing all of these people together in collaboration and thinking about what is our needs assessment, what do we need to do, what's our Western data look like, what is our data that maybe comes from more of a traditional or indigenous lens, what are our needs for our families and our students, and how do we work in collaboration to make sure that that's happening and fitting in what's best for our community. So again, it's not just one person or just a couple people. This was a huge lift for many different people. I would say probably hundreds of people coming in and weighing in and also helping with that particular lift, making sure that this worked.
So through the grant writing process, I think it's also important to actually build in partnerships for the writing of the grant and the budget. Even if the people that are writing the grant aren't necessarily going to be involved with the implementation, that you do have a wide variety of stakeholders at the table writing the grant together based on previous experience, based on existing programs, and ideally including key personnel who will be involved with the implementation of the grant. Because it's really a fun thing to write a grant and think, pie in the sky. But at the end of the day, that pie in the sky has to be implemented if it's funded. And it's hard to really envision all of the things that could possibly come up during the life of the grant. For example, we over time have really realized the key importance of that cultural piece in terms of the dancing and the drumming and developing kasbaks, which are Alaska Native sort of tops. And so having to write some budget change requests, if you will, were needed along the way, because we realized that that was a really important piece that we missed during the initial application process.
I love what Brandon was talking about, and I think that's probably one of the greatest lessons learned in all of this work, is to not do it alone, to not try and do this whole thing alone. And so what we have learned along the way with our grantees is to have memorandum of agreements in place before a proposal ever goes in. In fact, as Brandon was saying, it's important to have partners at the table talking about this, working through it. As he was saying, there's no way you could have thought of every moving part or every possible thing that could happen or every barrier or risk that might come into play. So having a memorandum of agreement with your partners, whether you're working with a tribe, a tribal education agency, the school district, maybe there's subject matter experts, maybe there's SMEs in the community that you believe are going to be really important. Maybe there's assessment folks that are going to be there. Our grantees have found that they didn't always have those memorandum of agreements in place. And so it halted the project many times trying to get those partners on board so that the work could be done. The NIA states that MOA needs to be signed no sooner than April the 28th of this year. So any MOA that was written or signed prior to that is not valid. So we learned, we learned very early on that we have to have memorandum of agreements in place, or the grantees are not going to likely be as successful. So that was a real lesson learned from this cohort of grantees. A lot of them had MOAs in the application that were either, not signed or are not current. So they struggled to get those partnerships in place the way that they really needed to. Your MOA should describe roles and responsibilities of each partner. I think that it's important to understand that it is a partnership, that it's not just one-sided. A partnership by nature is mutually beneficial. And so you want to always describe in MOA what's going to happen around implementation, who's going to give the data, who's going to help with recruiting and retaining native language instructors. So as we work through this project with the grantees, they were working through those MOAs and learning how to put the right stuff into the MOA so that the partnership really was mutually beneficial, and it was very clear the roles and responsibilities for each of those partners. Okay. All right, Sarah.
So our next topic is professional development, and we're going to listen into how each of the programs approach professional development just a little bit differently.
When writing the grant proposal, we were very cognizant of building in some really key professional development opportunities for the staff, not just the teachers, but the teaching assistant, the principal, and actually other teachers in the school district were able to participate in that in terms of sharing and collaborating with our new UPIC team. So one of the things that we did was we went to Bethel and visited their UPIC immersion program there. We're able to meet teachers, talk to the principal, observe classrooms, look at materials. We were able to go to one of the Hawaiian immersion programs in Hilo. And Hawaii has been doing Hawaiian revitalization for a good 40 years. They've got a really, really great statewide model. And so taking a look at their program from their pre-K all the way up to a PhD level at their university system was very eye-opening. And we've partnered with some really top-notch language immersion experts and professors around the country in terms of either bringing them up for professional development workshops or sending our team to participate in a workshop that was already pre-scheduled.
Language teacher program, we bring in trainees to sort of shadow lead teachers and help out in the classroom, aides, if you will. And with those aides, they're either not very proficient, but far along in their educational program to where they're nearing a teacher certification in some given institution nearby. Or they're very far along in their language learning and really new in the certification process. So some of our aides fall into one of those categories. So with the ones that aren't very proficient, they spend time with somebody who's much more proficient than them and sort of shadow them, take notes. We provide classes, explicit language classes and tutoring and that kind of thing. So we sort of coach their language ability while they're getting the hands-on teacher training. With our language teacher trainees, we assess them every year, typically late fall, to see where they're at with their language ability. And we've seen some pretty substantial growth among many of them. So their language assessment is a sort of formal assessment. It's just oral communicative assessment. It has nothing to do with reading or writing. Where we sit down in an interview style. So it's modeled after ACFL's, this, American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, a massive organization in the field of language assessment, language proficiency assessment. So we use ACFL's OPI model, the oral proficiency interview, so we've modified that as well to make it more Anishinaabe-centric, as well as our language guidelines, our proficiency guidelines. We've written all our own language proficiency guidelines. So with those interviews we do, those are one-on-one. So rather, when we work with the kids, it's 2 at a time. With the adults, it's just 1 at a time. And we'll basically sit down, record as natural as we can, conversation between myself and the trainees. Good thing is I know all of them, it's the same thing with the kids, I have an established rapport, which makes it a little more comfortable and a little more natural. Though it can be pretty awkward, especially everybody sort of insecure of their language ability. Everybody, from our best speakers to our newest speakers, everybody's insecure. So it can be kind of awkward, can be kind of stressful, but we try to make it as natural and not very high stakes. It's basically to inform us of what we're doing and what's working, and to inform our trainees as to what they can do to improve and climb up the proficiency scale. So we're always resetting our goals around here on where we want to be personally. So we have some really self-driven, motivated language trainees who are doing one heck of a job, picking up Ojibwe at a pace we've never seen before. Everybody that I knew who spoke Ojibwe as a second language, took them at least 10 years before they got very, very good at it. Whereas these trainees are picking up Ojibwe within a year or two, very functionally proficient in Ojibwe. So it's definitely working, though we're always looking for ways to improve it. Yeah, so we'll do, with our language trainees, we'll do a lot of coaching in the form of classes. Observations, I think, are really helpful. So we'll sit in classes while they're teaching and just take notes. A lot of times those notes will include vocabulary, specific vocabulary for the content areas that they're teaching. And then other sort of grammatical notes, on what they could be saying better, more accurate in Ojibwe. And then meeting one-on-one and sort of coaching them through that process, giving them notes, giving them resources, handouts, recordings, whatever it may be for their own sort of personal learning. And then we do offer classes, through our teacher training program, where they actually get college credit for taking classes, which help, I think, with their proficiency as well. I think a lot of times we get stuck in a rut if we're teaching in a classroom. We're mainly focused on the language we need for day-to-day to survive in the classroom, whereas we may be at a loss for terminology or much linguistic ability outside of the classroom. So trying to maintain a sort of holistic approach to language learning so it lives beyond the confines of the school.
So you see each of the grantees approach professional development a little bit differently, but ideally just looking at what was going to be most effective for their team. So they really had to begin both in their planning process and then once they began initial implementation with how they could best prepare and support their teachers, their staff, and their administrators, whether they were starting out with a lot of new staff or whether they were primarily utilizing their existing staff. They still had to think about how to prepare and support them for this new endeavor, this new project. They had to build a professional development plan that included the types and quantity of events and support that would be provided, who would participate. They had to think about any budgetary implications, such as paying trainers or compensating the staff for attending these trainings and classes. Like Mike shared, a lot of their teachers actually engage in college level courses that they're doing evenings and weekends outside of their normal work day. So the current grantees really address professional development in a myriad of ways, from the development of a master apprentice model, like you saw with Duca Dotting, and that really addressed both staff language learning and instructional learning. Many of the grantees provided for their staff to attend national conferences. Others did observations of other high quality programs who were doing similar styles of language learning. And then also many consulted with subject matter experts to provide workshops for their staff. Another thing that was really helpful for many of the grantees was to include staff beyond just their native language instructors. So for instance, one grantee who was launching a new native language program within an English medium school made sure that they included that school's principal in their training and in a site visit to an existing program so that they could truly understand the concept better of what that program was supposed to look like in action and what the goals were, and just have a little better seat at that discussion moving forward. Another provided basic native language instruction and cultural competence training to their entire school staff to help create a more inclusive school environment. So they really had to think through what was going to be the best fit for their staff and ensure that staff were well trained, because they found that the better they were able to support and train their staff, the more staff tended to have good job satisfaction and longevity. So they were able to keep their staff for longer periods, which is always a challenge in many programs. Next, we're going to think about your plan for instruction and what that kind of looked like. So everyone was expected to provide a grade level and developmentally appropriate plan for instruction in or through a Native American language. But as they created that plan and really thought about how to be ambitious but reasonable, they had to think about what they could feasibly accomplish within their 3-year project. Because just like Brandon pointed out in that one clip, it's easy in that planning process for the whole team to sit down and think up these wonderful things that everyone wants for the program. But then when they started actually implementing, they really had to think about, okay, what promises did I make in the grant? Because I have to meet those. And so they really had to be careful in their planning and in their grant writing to make feasible promises. So in their plan, they had to address what language learning model they were going to use. So whether that be full immersion, dual language, partial immersion. We have a few grantees who do more of an elective or FLES model where they provide maybe 45 minutes every day or a few days a week of native language instructioning. It was really important to determine what was the best fit, not just for their program, but also for their community, for their staff, their students, and their language. So for instance, they really had to think through, did they have a sufficient number of fluent educators? So if they wanted to do a full immersion model, they were going to need to have enough teachers with that level of language ability in order to have a full immersion program. If they did not, then they had to think about, okay, maybe at the end of our 3-year grant period, our goal is to be immersion. Maybe that's our ultimate goal. But in the meantime, maybe we're going to start out with a dual language or partial immersion model, because that's what we have the staff available for. And then through our project, we're going to be providing that professional development support and training to then progress our program to full immersion. They may have decided that an elective model was better, maybe in a high school student schedule where it's always very tight to fit in the various things for graduation, and also just that level of instruction for, say, a calculus class in native language. Then they had to think through, maybe an elective is better. And if we're going to do that, what does that look like? So really just thinking through what was going to be the best fit, both for the project and the program and the community and the kids. Then they had to really think about, you know, then what percentage of the school day is that? How many hours a week of instruction are the kids actually getting? They had to think about, do they have the resources? So even if you have the staff and you have lots and lots of fluent staff, sometimes they would then realize, even though I have all these teachers, I don't have any existing curriculum. I don't have any existing assessments. I don't have any instructional materials. So that might still slow down. Okay, maybe they weren't ready for a full immersion model, but during that first year, they were developing all the curriculum that they were going to need for the next year. And they were starting to work on that assessment. Many of them created additional instructional materials, such as posters, handouts, recordings of things. Many created also like picture books and things for their younger students. So they really had to think about, what are all those additional materials that needed to be developed to make that plan for instruction feasible and to make it a reality. They also had to think about the grade levels that were going to be served, how many schools they were going to be serving. So for instance, there's one grantee that serves 8 different campuses because they're doing an elective model. And so their instructors travel school to school providing this elective course. Thinking about how many students are going to be served. One of the big lessons learned for that group was that just because they had a certain number of students at a campus who were of that descent didn't mean they all were going to sign up for the elective. And so setting goals that really were still achievable and thinking through, how could they recruit those students? So for students who maybe had not had any exposure to their native language and culture, how could they broach that topic with that student and their family and engage them in that learning experience? Most of that information also had to be included in their grant on their information form. And again, making sure that what they put in their information form in their grant were things that they were able to then accomplish, because the things in their grant were the promises that they were making. So we're going to hear just a short clip, kind of thinking about that student recruitment piece.
So in terms of sustainability of the program, I like to think of immersion programs as actually being less expensive than, for example, a traditional middle school or high school foreign language classroom, or a FLES model at the elementary level where you have a specialist that teaches the language. You know, kids need to be in a classroom no matter what, so it doesn't really matter if they're in a classroom where the teacher is speaking to them in English all day long, or if they're in a classroom where they're getting their instruction in a second language, or in this case, in both. My concern is that it's really hard in immersion programs to add students to a program in the upper grades. And so just through natural attrition, if students move, students leave the program for whatever reason, the numbers start to go down. And so the sustainability piece, in terms of that, the concern is that we would have smaller class sizes, which would not necessarily fit into the matrix of how schools are staffed.
All right. So as Brandon was discussing, you know, there is going to be natural attrition over the years of the program. And many of our grantees also had student groups that were more transient. And so they had to think about students who might be coming in and out of their program model. So they had to really think about those in advance, as well as students who maybe wanted to jump into the program at a later age. All right, so I don't see any particular questions in the chat box, so we'll keep going. But if you have any as we go, make sure and pop those in. And we're going to go straight into thinking about your staffing.
Our inaugural year, we were very lucky because our kindergarten teacher, as well as our program coordinator, were both teaching at a charter school here in Anchorage, both of whom are native Yupik speakers, and were recruited heavily to come to this program. And really the two of them have been the rock of the program. We were fortunate to find a first grade teacher from a village close to Bethel, also a native speaker, and also an experienced teacher. And so we are constantly recruiting and are constantly looking for teachers, and we try to do that a year in advance. So this entire school year, we have already been scouting out, looking for our second grade teacher for next year.
So staffing has definitely been one of the biggest challenges for the existing grantees. It hasn't been an easy task to find instructional staff that were proficient in their native language and experienced certified educators. They had to carefully consider how many instructional staff they were going to need, as well as how many support staff, what education or experience they were required to have, whether it be from the state kind of certification requirements, as well as possibly from their organization. And then also what education and experience they needed them to have based on what they wanted to do in their program. They had to think about whether their staff were required to be certified teachers or whether there were alternative means of certification in their particular states. They had to think about what language proficiency was going to be needed in order to implement their plan for instruction. And then they also had to think about what types of preparation and support were needed, both at the initial onset of the project and then throughout that 3-year period, in order to ensure that the staff were set up for success as well as the program. So some grantees were able to leverage staff that were not as proficient in the language, but were actively engaged in learning as teacher aides, curriculum developers, cultural activity leaders, tutors, or staff in non-immersion learning environments. And then they were able to tie that into their professional development plan. So thinking through how they could go ahead and start growing those language skills themselves, how they could start growing those instructional skills themselves to kind of set up their own staffing pipeline. Courses, notice that Angela has popped over in the chat box some correlating information from the NIA in regards to personnel. So we're going to go to everybody's favorite topic, budget. So as we think about budget, this was another area that was of particular question and lesson learned area for most grantees. So while not everyone was necessarily experienced in federal budgeting and administering a federal grant, it was a necessity that they figure out how to do that and figure out how to do that quickly. So they had to set up a strong system, and the quicker they were to do that in the beginning, the easier it was on them throughout the life of their grant because they had a plan in place for fiscal procedures. So all of their budgetary costs were required to be reasonable and necessary for the proposed project. They had to consistently expend their funds in alignment with their planned grant activities. And G5 is the system through which monies are drawn down from the federal government. They were required to have regular drawdowns because if money was not being drawn down regularly, that brought up two areas of concern. Were monies being expended appropriately? And was there appropriate progress being made on the grant activities if no money's being spent? So they could draw down their monies as often as they wanted. Some did almost weekly, but at least to do it quarterly with an ideal option of hopefully drawing down those monies on a monthly basis. So as they also looked at that, they had to think about, they were awarded their monies at the end of September, beginning of October, and then we're expected to rapidly begin project implementation. The NAL ED grant does not have a planning period included like some may, and so they really had to have a strong plan in place to be able to start that immediate implementation of project activities. And then the other thing that really became key for them and that they learned how to do quickly was to have a procedure and process in place to monitor expenditures on a regular basis. So they weren't just relying on monthly or quarterly reports from a fiscal office. They were actually keeping track of those expenditures on a regular basis so that they could make sure that expenditures were happening, that drawdowns were happening, and that everything was being utilized appropriately from a fiscal standpoint. The other piece within this section is to think about sustainability of their projects beyond the 3 years of the grant award. So I'm going to play just a quick clip in regards to that sustainability thought.
In terms of thinking about the future and the sustainability of the program, I think that the really solid professional development that we built in early on was a critical piece to the success of the program. And we have a structure in place now, and we've got the materials to get us going. And so at this point, it's really about maintaining and continuing with the translation of the next, grade level one at a time. But like any new program, word of mouth has to be out there.
So you'll notice that Anchorage was able to utilize their project to set themselves up for sustainability. So even though through their project they were only providing instruction through 2nd grade, their other grant activities allowed them to set up a project structure that could go throughout the next few grade levels. And they also set up assessments and curriculum all the way through 6th grade, so that a lot of those more expensive pieces were taken care of through their actual grant project to set them up for less expensive years outside of the federal funding. So some sustainability things that they really thought about as they went through were how to continue their project after that 3-year federal funding, because while they are eligible to apply for another round of federal funding, as we all know in the world of grants, nothing is guaranteed, and so you have to always be thinking about that. And so they really had to think about what other options they had available. They had to think about how to utilize other funding sources, whether it be district or organization funds, or some of them were able to utilize Title VI formula grant funds. But with that, they had to think about how much of that Title VI grant they would be able to use, when they would be able to start using it, and getting it approved by the parent committee. So all of that had to be thought of in advance, and they really had to work through that. Angela has popped over in the chat box some information from the NIA in regards to adequacy of resources, that budget piece, as well as the competitive preference priority 1 in regards to utilization of Title VI formula grant funds. Now, our last chunk here is in regards to the management plan. So as we think about this, I really want to focus in on project leadership, because this is kind of the last piece of lessons learned from the grantees. And that was that they really needed some consistent project leadership that had the right setup. And so by that, I mean having the right people in those leadership roles that had the right amount of time dedicated to this project to ensure it was successful. So many of them had project directors that were not 100% allocated to this project, but they had to really think about what percentage was necessary in order to make this successful. Some found that having a 100% project director was the easier method and was integral in making their project more successful. Some had a project director who maybe had a certain percentage allocated to this project, but they had a full-time dedicated project coordinator. And so through that, they had that leadership piece on a regular, consistent basis that had the right amount of time dedicated to making this large multi-piece grant work for them. And then also had to think through what other key project personnel were needed in order to set themselves up for success. So Angela has popped over in the chat box some other information from the NIA specific to your management plan. So as you think about these lessons learned in regards to project leadership, and then you can check out that information in the chat box. And then we'll hear one final clip here in regards to project leadership.
So one of the key components of the grant that we wrote was to build in a program coordinator specific to this program. In my role with the school district, I oversee all language programs at all levels, kindergarten through 12th grade. And as devoted as I am to this particular program, especially in terms of the grant writing and managing the grant, the success of the program is definitely not due to me. We have a program coordinator, Katie Tanuchik, who has really been the driving force of the program in terms of working with staff, working with parents, working with the principal. She's really the community face of the program, if you will. And being Alaska Native and Yupik herself, she brings that perspective to the program and can easily work with Alaska Native families and encourage them to consider putting their child in this program. She also takes really good care of the teachers and does a lot of outside community work in terms of organizing cultural field trips. This grant has received quite a bit of publicity from not just local media, but media from outside. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, we had a group of visitors from Japan. Japan's only indigenous group came over to visit this program. And so the program has gotten a lot of attention, and there needed to be a point person for that to really to allow the program to shine. So having a program coordinator is a very, very integral part of the grant and of any program, really. We're very fortunate to have her in this role, and I sure wish that we had a program coordinator in all of our other immersion programs.
So like in the Anchorage School District example, they actually, since Brandon was only able to allocate a small percentage of his time to this project, had Katie, who was able to devote her full attention to the project. And as Brandon shared, that was really integral to their project. Now we're going to move into our final tips as we near the end of our time together today, and just reviewing some of the really important lessons learned. So one of the things being making sure that all required components from the NIA are in the grant proposal, completing the application information form as outlined in the NIA, addressing all 5 selection criteria and the subtopics within each, many of which have been referenced in the chat box as we've gone through today. How helpful our grantees found it utilizing the SMART goals and objectives to help ensure that those were specific and measurable, and that they were, as we've said over and over, ambitious but reasonable. That they were very specific about their implementation timeline, that they really had laid out what they expected to accomplish in year 1, year 2, and year 3 of their projects. That they had signed memorandums of agreement with all of their partners, remembering that in the NIA, those must be within the last 4 months. And really important with their budget, that their budget, their actual number form budget, and their budget narrative matched and addressed all 3 years. So they had thought through that piece for the full life of their project and included that. All right, and I see a question in the chat box. Can the MOA be submitted after the funding is awarded, or does it have to be submitted with the application? And the NIA does ask that those MOAs be submitted as part of the proposal. All right, and that does move us to our final questions. Kathleen, do you see any questions over in the chat box right now that I've missed?
Scroll up. Most of the questions so far have been around being able to get a copy of this presentation. And yes, we will send a PDF copy of the presentations, which unfortunately won't include the videos at this time, but we can send that to everybody's email.
And the recording will go up on the website as well.
On which website? Oh, on the
OESE.
Okay.
So, and we'll have other Sarah pop that link back in the chat box. As you're thinking about any final questions you may have, just a reminder that this webinar was sharing promising practices and lessons learned by our grantees during the first 3 years of the NAL ED grant. It was not intended to cover all of the information that you'll need in order to successfully apply for the current NAL ED grant competition. We really encourage you to visit the link that Sarah has popped in the chat box in order to access the notice inviting applications and the full application package, to review the recording of the pre-application workshops that have gone on over the last 2 weeks. In the next couple of days, we will have the recording of this webinar up there as well. And that is also where you will be able to submit your notice of intent to apply if you have not done so yet. While that is not required, it is encouraged, and you'll be able to access at that link a list of all those who have already submitted their notice of intents to apply. So we have a question in the chat box: will an applicant be accepted without MOAs? Are MOAs required as part of the application, or they would strengthen the application? And I will let Angela weigh in here as well. The initial response would be MOAs would be required for any partnerships.
Yes, so Sarah, thank you. Quickly, I'll just say that if you go to the notice inviting applications, they're under the application requirements. It states, for memorandum of agreement, any applicant that proposes to work with a partner to carry out the proposed project must include a signed and dated memorandum of agreement that describes the roles and responsibilities. I'm not going to read it in its entirety outside of to say, yes, it is feasible, allowable for an applicant to apply on their own. I would ask you to also spend some time looking at the selection criteria, as there is at least one sub-criterion that does speak to the prospect of partnerships and the extent to which you're leveraging those in order to be able to strengthen the quality of the project proposed. Thanks, Sarah.
Okay.
And there's another question: how would I approach this grant if there are 2 languages in the school? Yes, that is allowable, but I would encourage you with questions that are specific to your individual projects. You'll want to email NAL, N-A-L, @ed.gov for those more project-specific questions, and we'll put that in the chat box as well. Since we are just a couple minutes over time, I did want to just give you our last reminder that the application is due Friday, August 28th, 2020. It must be submitted via grants.gov, and it must be submitted by 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time on August 28th. My final tip to you would be to make sure and upload that in advance. Grants.gov can sometimes take an extensive amount of time to upload those proposals, as they tend to be large documents. So if you begin trying to upload right before the deadline, it might not upload in time, and any documents received after 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time on August 28th will not be reviewed. So we've put it over in the chat box, but I'm going to share again some contact info as we pop up our final poll. Was this webinar beneficial for you and or your organization? You can answer yes or no there on the poll on the screen as I share with you again that contact information. So if you have any project specific questions, or if you think of questions after the webinar today, you can reach out to nal@ed.gov. And if you have any specific questions about grants.gov or need support with that system, You can email support@grants.gov, or you can call the 800 number listed there on the screen. We appreciate you taking the time to join us today. We hope this has been helpful and beneficial, and that you've enjoyed getting a little peek into some of the amazing work that NAL grantees have been doing over the last 3 years. If you have any final questions, we will take those from the chat box. Otherwise, have a wonderful rest of your Thursday.